Next chapter, feeling. Grandfather told me that there was an energy that connected everything in the world, actually everything in the universe. The universe is the world of all the worlds together, and it also includes the space that holds them together. Grandfather said that what we think of as empty space is really the glue that holds everything together, including ourselves, and that this glue is an energy that is invisible to our eyes, but not to our bodies. He said our bodies can see this energy, and that is how he saw me, even though I was really far away. He said my energy was really loud. In fact, my energy at that time was yelling, crying out to the rest of the universe, and that is why he came to get me. Did he tell you how he had learned to see your energy? So how does your body see that energy? Are our bodies blind? Mom and Dad never told me about that energy. Is there an eye that we can open and close? Grandfather told me that our blindness comes from the fact that we learn to think about that energy rather than to see it. He said our skin is like a giant eye that can see much more than we think, and that our thinking learns to doubt that that energy exists because it is invisible, and we have difficulty talking about things that are invisible. Our thinking is used to connecting to things that we can see or hear or touch, but the energy that exists that we become blind to is a feeling. He also said that as children we have feelings that grown-ups don't want to know about, feelings that make grown-ups uncomfortable because they have learned to hide, and to hide their ability to feel. He told me that the people I come from would rather be blind than to acknowledge that feelings are deeper than thinking. We have learned to think that thinking can do everything, but that is like a dog chasing its own tail. He said that when thinking learns to justify itself, it then disconnects from our other ways of knowing. He told me that was why it was so important for me to take my clothes off when I went into the mountains or the sea, so that my entire body could remember to see again. He said clothes were like a blindfold that we put on our body, so no wonder we bump into things that we forbid ourselves to see. He said the people that I come from try to hide the way a baby sees from the time it is born, but that they're really hiding their own blindness. He said our babies are deeply saddened by the way we treat them, as if they were blind, as if their bodies can't see, and that we then treat the entire world that way. And that is how we lose our connection to everything. He said we are particularly brutal to those people that have retained their ability to see, and that in treating them as if they were blind, we just show them our own arrogance and blindness. Next chapter, more feeling. Wow, that's exciting. I think I've always known that my body can see, but there seems to be no way to talk about that with Mom and Dad. I'm so glad you've returned. There's so many things I need to hear from you. Grandfather sounds like a wonderful man. I do need to meet him. I do need to meet him. Cornelia was beside herself with joy. David heard Cornelia's words with a deeply satisfied understanding, and he realized there was hope for the world that he was born into. Not everyone ended up in the thinking prison as soon as they were born. He began to wonder if perhaps girls were more open to the way a body can see than boys were. Tell me what else Grandfather said about bodies being able to see. Cornelia was ecstatic. Well, he said that there was one problem that came with this ability, and this happens primarily with people who have refused to recognize that the body can see. What is that? Asked Cornelia, interested. Well, he said that the eye of the body can not only see, but that it can also send energy that others see. But that sounds like a great gift. Then people can talk to each other invisibly and over great distances. We wouldn't need telephones anymore. The problem is that people don't learn the difference between the energy that they send and the energy they receive, and that people who refuse to recognize that bodies can see also don't recognize the energies that they send. "I don't really understand this," said Cornelia. "Well, just because a person is blind to the energies, that doesn't mean that they stop sending or receiving those energies. But their thinking gets involved and thinks it can sort things out. But of course it can't. So thinking invents all kinds of stories to explain the things that happen as a result of this blindness. Grandfather said that thinking is like a sleep that people fall into, especially once their thinking is put down in signs and symbols. Then in that sleep they mistake their own thinking for the whole world, and they think that their thinking is more real than the world itself. He said that people in their blindness and sleep have killed each other without really understanding why they are doing so. And he said that the blindness of the body that children are first taught is the beginning of the sleep of thinking that they then fall into. He told me that his own people have suffered tremendously because of the storytelling sleep that the invaders brought with them. Next chapter, storytelling sleep. I don't really understand what you mean by storytelling sleep. What I mean, and what Grandfather understood, is that people get lost in the stories that they tell without realizing that it is just a story and not the world that all life except humans live in. People tell stories or hear stories and then begin to believe that the stories are true. They begin to repeat the story to themselves and then act toward the world as if the story they are telling is more true than their own experience. And so people learn to carry around different stories. And when those stories don't agree with one another, then people think that they themselves are in conflict. People get stuck in their own stories. This is the prison that Elephant and Grandfather helped me realize was being built around me in school. Grandfather helped me to understand that thinking is something organic, just like breathing is, and that school is used to train thinking as if it were a monkey in a circus, so that it will do its tricks. Then it becomes automatic and mechanical, and the person thinks of themselves as educated, whereas they have actually sacrificed a great chunk of their own aliveness for the sake of this appearance. This is why Bearman and Grandfather went to such great lengths to help me realize that I needed to learn from myself, from my own experiences in nature, rather than thinking that someone else had all the answers, and that to be educated was just a matter of repeating someone else's answers. To be intelligent really means that your own thinking is completely related to the rest of who you are, and that is different from being educated. "That sounds complicated," said Cornelia sadly. "It sounds that way when we focus on the words and the ideas, rather than recognizing, first of all, what words and ideas are." "What are they then?" Grandfather says that people are a unique kind of animal. We are an animal that talks a lot. In fact, most people have learned to talk continuously, silently, to themselves. And this is what we call thinking. He said that we first learned to talk in order to let people know what was going on with us inside, with our feelings and our experience and our awareness. And he said the ability to do this was really a great gift. But in talking, we also need to learn to listen. And many people have learned to talk without listening. "But people do listen," Cornelia blurted out. "Yes, but many people only listen to their own talking. Or if they do listen, they listen through their own talking. They listen to hear if what someone else says is similar to or different from their own talking. So even though they seem to be listening, they're only listening through the noise of their own talking. And whatever they hear is relative to what they already think they know. So that people little by little get trapped in the stories that they tell over and over. And they feel comfortable in those stories only because the story is predictable. But it becomes predictable only because they tell it over and over. And this is how they form their own cages. They build their own cages and then think that they're safe in them." "Oh, I see. They fall asleep inside of their own stories. and this is storytelling sleep. I see now why Mom and Dad are so boring, and why they like to watch the news so much. They look for things that fit in with the stories they tell, and argue when the story is different. I often wondered why they get so angry sometimes at the man who is telling the news. Exactly. And this way they have difficulty really hearing me now, or you. They only want to hear the things that they already think. Anything else is unsafe. And this is why they have trouble listening to what Jessie tells me, said Cornelia, ecstatic. Yes, not only do they have trouble listening to other stories that don't fit in with their own, but their own stories include prohibitions against other things being able to talk. The stories they tell say that only they can think or talk. So this keeps them from really listening. And they call someone crazy who listens to the talking that everything in the world does. Everything talks in its own way. But people have invented a story that doesn't allow them to listen to anything other than people. So it's not that things can't talk, but that people have confused listening with talking, and their own listening has become deaf. Next chapter. Deaf People and Written Stories. Cornelia was really excited. David had helped her to understand why her mother and father seemed so dead. They weren't really zombies, she thought to herself. They had just learned to act like zombies by limiting the things they could do or know, and they had done this by becoming deaf to the way everything in this world talks. And their deafness had been built by the stories they told about other things not being able to talk, when in fact it was they that had given up listening. They had given up listening to anything other than their own stories. Suddenly everything was beginning to make sense again. Cornelia was so grateful that David had returned. She realized he was teaching her things that no one else could. No one else except perhaps grandfather. "But how did you manage to stay out of this prison?" Cornelia asked. "I always listened to Gordy and to Elephant, and I also talked to them and asked questions," David replied. "But why couldn't Mom and Dad do that too?" "I think it was too late. In fact, they began to look at me strangely whenever I told them what Gordy had said. So I stopped telling them about my talks with Gordy, and they never knew about Elephant. Somehow I knew that if I told them they would get very upset, and I was right. I understand that now, but at the time it didn't make any sense to me. It wasn't until I met Grandfather and Bearman that I understood that listening to the way everything talks is the way to stay connected to the world. Mother and Father used to call it making things up, but I see now that the stories they told themselves over and over was the real way of making things up. Listening to the world and hearing what it says is the way to stay connected, unless you want to be a dog chasing its own tail." David and Cornelia both laughed, but they knew that what they were talking about was very, very serious. And they were becoming more and more aware of the sad prisons that their mother and father lived in. And they also knew that Mother and Father would not feel safe until David and Cornelia told the same stories that they did. But if they did, then they would be sacrificing their own aliveness and their own intelligence. Next chapter, Freedom from Thinking. "But you think very clearly, and it sounds like Grandfather also thought very clearly. How did your own thinking stay so free?" "Grandfather told me that thinking is a great gift unless we get trapped in it. And the way not to get trapped in it is to stay out of it." "But how can you stay out of it and still think?" Cornelia asked, puzzled. "Grandfather said that by realizing that it is only one way of knowing and not the deepest way," answered David. "Are there other ways of knowing?" "Yes, there are. We have many different parts of ourselves that are alive. And Grandfather taught me that to adhere to any single one of them, or even to only a few, makes us smaller than we really are. We should be so large that there is room in us for every different dimension of who we are. And we also need to know that we can travel freely to any part of ourselves that needs to be present in any given situation. How do we travel to any part of who we are? Cornelia was more puzzled than ever. That's the job of our awareness. Our awareness should be free enough and also slippery enough to be able to go wherever in us it is needed. The trouble with telling ourselves the same story over and over again is that our awareness itself gets frozen to only one aspect of who we are, and the rest of ourself then feels abandoned or ignored. And whenever any part of us feels, we feel. Grandfather said it is like being autistic. Autistic children perform the same act over and over again, he said, and we think there is something wrong with them. But we don't even notice ourselves telling the same story over and over. We don't even recognize our own autistic thinking. Thinking should be free, like water, and able to take on the form of whatever situation we want to think about, or free to depict any situation we find ourselves in. He told me that very few people are at such a place because we live at a time when we confuse intelligence with various types of frozen thinking. And we have confused school with the ability to do repetitive thinking. He said the people I come from train their children from the time they're very young to repeat the same thing over and over again. And then they're very proud when the child does so. This pride, Grandfather said, is very characteristic of people who are stuck inside themselves. They think their own stuckness makes them better than others, and that people kill one another from that place of stuck pride. He said his people were forbidden to live their own lives because of where my people were stuck. And he said his own greatest sadness was for children who are deliberately frozen into only a small dimension of who they really are. He said a person who is whole, that is, all of whose living dimensions are fully in communication, can be completely trusted because such a person is balanced and has a living center. But a person who is stuck in only a small part of who he is always false, even to himself. And a person false to himself cannot be trusted. Cornelia was overwhelmed to hear such a clear understanding of people. She was hearing things that she inherently knew but had never heard before. She felt like fresh, clear water was washing through her entire being, and she was more determined now than ever to meet Grandfather, and she was deeply happy that David had returned. Next chapter, Bedtime. Bedtime arrived so swiftly that both David and Cornelia were surprised. The evening news had ended, and Father and Mother had entered the kitchen and informed the children that it was bedtime. After saying good night, Cornelia retired to her room, the room that had originally belonged to David. She was exhausted, but at the same time she felt elated, refreshed, in a way that thrilled her. The future was exciting and enticing. She could hardly wait for tomorrow, and renewed talks about life and about people. Every cell in her body felt alive and vibrant. She'd never felt so fresh before. David went to bed again in the guest room, thrilled that he had such an intelligent sister. He felt that he and Cornelia met in a place that was clear and yet full of a vision of possibilities. He couldn't believe even now that such a young child could have such a deep understanding. But he did know that there was something frustrating about living with Mother and Father, something that cried out for clarity and communication. Yet when this was attempted, both his parents seemed to close down in a frustrating and stuffy way. He realized that when with them there seemed to be no air to breathe, and it felt like trying to run through molasses. Cornelia had brought a refreshing new space into this home. He fell asleep easily, and dreamed about the village. Next chapter, Dream of the Village. David could see the village in the distance. He seemed to be flying high above it. Then he realized he was eagle, surfing on the air. The air was a landscape he could feel, with various layers of density, and he instinctively moved his wings and feathers in order to maintain a position on the surface of the sea of air that supported him. He was amazed at the power of his wings. With a few beats he could climb from one level to another. But even more amazing was the precision of his vision. He could see the village in its entire breadth, stretched out between the mountain and the sea, and at the same moment he could see very precisely what the various people below were doing. It was a kind of seeing that he had not known as a human. He realized that the village seemed much older than he had remembered it, and suddenly he saw several large ships in the sea, ships with large sails. Many tiny humans were swarming into small rowboats that were traveling back and forth between the ships and the village. And he looked more closely and saw that many of the men were dressed as sailors and had beards. Many of them at the edge of the village carried rifles or swords. He didn't recognize anyone in the village, and that surprised him, because he had known everyone when he lived there. A sudden realization jarred him. The village that he saw and the ships and all the people were several hundred years before his time. He was looking into a scene from the past. As he looked more precisely, he saw that the sailors were not at all interested in the life of the village, nor in the particular people that lived there, but they seemed glued to things in the village. They were going around touching some of the carved posts and handling various blankets, and even feeling some of the blankets and clothes and hats as the villagers were wearing them. This intrusiveness was exactly the opposite of the respect that he himself had known in the village. He realized that what he was seeing was a meeting of two different kinds of people, of two different cultures, and that what each culture experienced was very different. The sailors had no sense of the depth of feeling in the village culture, and the village people did not initially realize that the sailors were hardened and coarse and saw the world only in terms of acquisition. He knew that the main perspective in the village was a deep respect for aliveness itself, but the sailors seemed oblivious to the living people and only looked at things that were lifeless. With his eagle eyes, he saw that the sailors were arrogant and disrespectful toward the villagers, treating them like the goods they were inspecting, and that the villagers, with their natural respect for aliveness, were puzzled and perplexed. At one edge of the village, David saw one of the sailors touching a young girl in an aggressive way and showing her his teeth. Her father, standing nearby, grabbed him and pulled him away. Surprised, the sailor pointed his weapon at the man and fired. Everyone in the village froze as he fell to the ground, covered in blood. The two groups faced each other, the sailors with weapons drawn and the villagers not knowing how to respond. The tension seemed to cause the air itself to stand still, and Eagle sailed directly into the crowd. Eagle's claws raked across the face of the man who had fired, opening deep cuts. The man dropped his weapon and grabbed at his face with both hands. Every eye was on Eagle, and the sailors began a quick retreat to the boats that had carried them to the shore. The entire village knew that nature had come to protect them, and rushed at the sailors, pushing them toward the boats and sending them on their way. David awoke, panting and sweating. He couldn't seem to breathe deep or fast enough. Opening his eyes, he looked around the guest room, relieved to find himself here at his childhood home. But a part of him was still overlooking the village, aware of the conflict, and realizing that he was being called to action. He just didn't know what he was to do. This is the end of Book 2. Something is Something. I am the author and the reader, Steve Gallegos. I invite you to continue on with Book 3, Dream Visits.